A and B Psych Student Union. And to those of you who have logged on via Zoom, Amy, could you let me know that people can hear me on the Zoom connection? I think
yep, you're coming through loud and clear.
Excellent, thanks. And you can see my screen sharing, I hope?
Right now I don't see a screen share, I just see you.
Oh, you don't? Okay, all right.
No, but I did before.
All right, let me.
Mm-hmm.
All right, there we go.
There we go, perfect. That's
all
it.
Right. Good. All right, well, as I was saying, welcome to everyone online and in person. My name is Bradley Flamm. I'm the director of the Office of Sustainability here at Westchester University. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this, the 11th presentation in the Spring 2023 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. My office is proud to co-sponsor this series with the Office for Research and Sponsored Programs and with the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee. We have one more presentation this semester, 1 week from today. Professor Eliza Richmond from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology will be presenting results of a census, a sustainability census of Westchester University's community of students, faculty, and staff. It's going to be a fascinating presentation, and we encourage you to join us next week as well. But for now, this is the first time this semester that I'm switching from the introduction to part of the presentation, because I am happy to be here and joined by our colleagues, Professor Michael Giovine of the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. Hi. And with Professor Paul Sylvester from Early and Middle Grades Education. We are going to be talking about carbon offsets and relating them to the university's operations and the university's commitments to carbon neutrality. We're hoping to make this presentation a conversation, a discussion. It is a panel presentation, but I'd like to start by setting the stage with a brief 10 or 15 minute introduction to the topic. Let me make sure I can advance these slides. Let's see, is that working? It is on our end, so I suspect it is on the Zoom end as well. We're going to be talking about climate change, carbon emissions, and Westchester University's operations. And we'll follow that up by defining what carbon offsets are and think about how they can contribute to the educational mission of this university, particularly in relation to study abroad, which by definition involves a good amount of travel. So let's get started. This is typically a point in a presentation addressing the issue of climate change, in which speakers will talk about three key questions. One, is climate change real? Is it actually happening? Two, are human activities contributing to climate change? And three, do we know what the effects of climate change will be? The short answer to all of these questions is yes, yes, and yes. Climate change is happening. We have good scientific evidence of that fact. Human activities and the combustion of fossil fuels is contributing in a significant way to the fact that the climate is changing. And although we don't know precisely every impact of a warming global climate, we do have a good idea of what those impacts will be. And they are going to be a significant challenge for human life and for other creatures that live on this globe. So I'm not going to go through those in great detail. The science is clear, and I am going to proceed with this presentation on the assumption that there is agreement on the answers to those three questions. But I do want to highlight two facts in particular. The first is that the human population, if it has not already reached 8 billion people, is going to do so very soon. There are different estimates of the global population. I took a screen grab of this website, which is a US Census Bureau website, a couple of days ago. It hasn't clicked over 8 billion yet, but there are United Nations agencies that have estimated that we've already passed that point. This is a really interesting fact because there have never been that many Homo sapiens existing on this planet. Scientists will define different dates, and our anthropologist probably has a better idea of the date, but I'm going to say that anatomically modern Homo sapiens have been around for about 250 to 400,000 years. That seems to be the range of estimates of when creatures who are like us first evolved on this planet. That means that for more than 99.9% of the history of human beings living on this planet, there were not even 1 billion people. We hit 1 billion people in about the year 1800, a little bit after that. But this is extraordinary in the history of our species living on this planet. Another extraordinary fact is that in that time, in the time that modern humans have existed on this planet, we have never existed in conditions that we are creating with the combustion of fossil fuels that we are responsible for. The slide to the top left dates back to 1880 and demonstrates a fairly significant increase in temperature based upon a time range, an average time range from about 1960 to about 1990. The second slide goes back even farther, and humans' presence on the planet corresponds to roughly that bracket that I put on the screen. So the takeaway from these slides is that we just have never lived on a world that is as hot as we expect the world to become if we don't stop emitting as much carbon as we have been emitting. So this is another point in presentations about climate change that you often will see a slide that shows images of flooding, of wildfires, of sea level rise, of parched drought conditions, of migrants in desperate circumstances, leaving their homes for a place that they can survive. And I'm not going to include all of those, in part because it makes me sad to put all those pictures up. But I have put some excerpts of the types of language that scientists who have been involved in an organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a large body of scientists from a wide variety of disciplines, including climate scientists, have been issuing for the past 25 years. And the language has become increasingly urgent over that time period. And they are encouraging all of us to take this threat of climate change seriously and to act, to make choices that will help us reduce our combustion of fossil fuels so that we can keep living conditions on this planet within a livable range. Westchester University is not alone in having made some commitments to this reality, to reacting to this reality. I'm not going to go through all of the milestones that I've listed on this slide, but the short summary is that dating back to the 1970s, there have been students and faculty and staff at this university who have understood this challenge and have encouraged the university as an institution to take action to maintain our educational mission while we're also taking actions that will help us reduce our carbon emissions and to achieve carbon neutrality in our current climate action plan. We've pledged to do that by 2025, which, as you know, is just a couple years away. We measure our impact on carbon emissions, as most institutions of higher education do, by looking at three broad categories of carbon emissions that we are responsible for. The first are those that we refer to as Scope 1, and these are on-campus carbon emissions from fossil fuel combustion. So this refers to all the natural gas that we burn to keep some of our buildings warm in the winter months. We also burn some heating oil, which is the most carbon intensive form of heating fuel that we could use. And ironically, the building that the Office of Sustainability is located in is one of the buildings that is still heated with heating oil. We also burn a lot of gasoline and diesel and compressed natural gas to operate our vehicle fleet. And so we have to take responsibility for all of those emissions by documenting what they are and calculating how many tons of carbon is emitted because of those operations that we need to do in order to meet our academic and educational goals. We also track our use of electricity. What we call purchased electricity is what comes through the grid via PICO to this university so that we can keep the lights on, we can have projectors and computers working the way we need them to do, to operate the way that we operate. Those emissions are not happening on our campus the way that the natural gas combustion in some of the buildings, I think, including Sykes, emit. These are emissions that are happening at the power plants in a large multi-state grid that we draw from in order to keep the lights on. Some of that electricity is generated through solar and wind, but most of it is generated through natural gas powered plants, some nuclear, as you probably know, and through some coal-fired power plants that are still operating in this part of the country. And we have to take responsibility for our share of the electricity that we're drawing on. And then finally are our Scope 3 emissions, and we call these indirect emissions because largely they are emissions that the university is not directly responsible for, but we have to document. So it does involve things like the solid waste that we send to landfills, the wastewater that we send into the sewer system to treatment plants, as well as things like commuting to and from campus, and all of the travel associated with the university's business operations and administration, but also travel from study abroad. We try to track all of these indirect emissions and take responsibility for them in our reporting. Now, the short good news is that this university has made very good progress. Between 2010, which is our base year for monitoring, and the most recent fiscal year, that's what the FY in the graph stands for, of 2022, the most recent one that's completely finished, our total emissions dropped by 29%. That's pretty good. That's almost a third. And many institutions that have been trying to reduce their carbon emissions have not made that much progress. Right? That happened at a time that our student body increased by almost 20%. And during the same time period, we added new buildings on campus. So the total square footage of building space on campus increased by about 16%. So we had more people on campus. We had more buildings to heat and cool and keep the lights on, and we still reduced our total emissions by 29%. which means that on a per person basis at this university, our emissions dropped by 38% over that time frame. That is really good progress, but it is also not a level of progress that is going to get us to that goal of carbon neutrality by 2025. We are not on track to reaching that, and we're not even on track to reaching that by 2050 at the rate we're going. Right? That's a challenge for us, and we have to admit the reality. We have to acknowledge the difficulty we're having in meeting our original goal. And so the Sustainability Council at Westchester University, working with our office, the Office of Sustainability, has undertaken a process to update our climate action plan. We're going to change that title to Climate and Sustainability Action Plan because it's not solely focused on carbon emissions. Our plan, even our first one, and the updated version includes important strategies and objectives that we're going to pursue in terms of food systems on campus and our transportation systems and our learning and academics, bringing concepts of sustainability into all of those areas of our academics and operations. But we've not finished this document yet, but we have identified that we need to revisit that original carbon neutrality by 2025 goal. Acknowledging the progress we've made and the difficulty of achieving carbon neutrality, and thinking about the pathways that we have within each of those three scopes that I talked about earlier. What we're proposing at the moment is that we actually extend our Scope 1 emissions goal an additional 10 years to 2035. Right now on this campus, we heat and cool almost half of building space on North Campus with a system called geothermal heating and cooling. It's very energy efficient, and it can be carbon neutral if we are running the pumps for that system and the heat exchangers with electricity that has been procured from solar or wind generated power plants, right? So we've made good progress, but we cannot convert the rest of the 50% of building space on campus to geothermal by 2025. That's simply not possible. We know we're going to need more time to plan, to obtain funding, to design, to construct, and then to start operating that expanded system. So we're proposing to extend that to 2035. We do think we can keep our purchased electricity goal of carbon neutrality by 2025 if we're able to negotiate a power purchase agreement to procure all of our electricity from solar and or wind generated power. There's still a pathway that could get us to carbon neutrality by 2025, so we're hoping to maintain that. Scope 3, those indirect emissions are much, much harder. The transportation sector is a tough nut to crack in terms of carbon neutrality. There are things that can be done. Electric vehicles, if they're powered by solar or wind electricity, can in their operations be considered carbon neutral. But it is going to take time for us to get there, particularly in that the university doesn't control all of the individual decisions by the 20,000 people, students, faculty, and staff who are part of this community, right? So we know we're going to have to set a much later goal for that if we are going to actually reduce those emissions to zero. That challenge and the fact that we want to work as urgently as we can means that we need to think about carbon neutrality using a variety of strategies. And one strategy that we want to discuss as part of the mix of strategies that we could use is the purchase of what are called carbon offsets. Right, so what is a carbon offset? Essentially, a carbon offset is a fee that represents the cancellation of the impact of carbon emissions by investing in projects that reduce or store carbon, right? So typically we think of reforestation projects or projects that preserve and allow to grow groves of trees because they take carbon out of the atmosphere and fix it in the physical features of those trees, all right? But there are also carbon offset programs that are focused more on the reduction of fossil fuel use. And this can be wind farms, solar cook stoves, different and better regenerative farming methods, and others, right? Now, carbon offsets have generated a small industry of organizations that help buyers and sellers connect to each other. So there are four types of actors involved here. The first is the buyers and sellers. There are organizations that want to be able to purchase carbon offsets and organizations that want to be able to sell carbon offsets. All right, they play an important role in this because they create the market and the demand for it. Lost part of my notes here. No, I found them. There are also organizations that are registries of projects that meet certain criteria to be sold, bought and sold as carbon offset projects. There are four big carbon registries. The American Carbon Registry, Verified Carbon Standards, they call it BERRA, B-E-R-R-A, a group called Gold Standard, and something called the Climate Action Reserve. These are registries that document these projects. There are also third-party validation and verification bodies that actually go through the work to ensure that a project that says it's going to sequester 100 tons of carbon actually is doing what it says it's doing. And then there's a fourth group of actors, which are service providers who conduct monitoring and reporting and verification, right? So it's become something of a small industry. And if Westchester University, for example, were to want to purchase some carbon offsets, there are systems and markets in which we can participate in order to purchase carbon offsets. These couple of images and the image on the next slide are from what I think is a very good summary of carbon offsets. The URL is kind of hard to see right there, but we are going to distribute a copy of these slides, and it will include a link to the story that we've stolen a couple of images from. There are challenges with carbon offset projects, and there are criticisms of some of those projects over time. Some of the criticisms relate to the credibility and transparency of projects. Some are related to environmental and social impacts of some of these projects, which have exacerbated some social inequities in some parts of the world. There have been issues of greenwashing, of projects that either lack additionality, meaning they're not actually projects that wouldn't have happened without the carbon offsets. There are projects that have over-credited the impact. They've sold credits for 100 tons of carbon sequestration and perhaps delivered actually 10 tons. And then there are projects that have double counted the impacts. They found a buyer who wanted to purchase 100 tons of carbon offsets, and then they found another buyer who wanted to buy the same 100 tons of carbon offsets. So there have been some problems with it. And some will argue that the possibility of carbon offsets creates a mindset in which people feel they can just do business as usual and buy their way out of their responsibility for the carbon emissions that they are responsible for. Right? There are ways of addressing those challenges. One recent example of some principles being published and promoted come from Oxford University in the United Kingdom. There's a link there at the bottom, but I wanted to highlight the first three priorities that they talked about. One is prioritizing reducing emissions first, meaning looking at an institution's own operations and looking at the extent to which Westchester University, for example, can reduce our carbon emissions before needing to go out and purchase carbon offsets. When carbon offsets are purchased, prioritize looking for high quality, verifiable, transparently managed carbon offsets. And finally, focus on offsets that actually remove carbon from the atmosphere rather than just reducing carbon emissions. All right, so that's setting the stage, which is important because Westchester University, we want to achieve carbon neutrality, but there are some aspects of our carbon emissions that there is not right now an obvious way that we can on our own reduce them to zero. So keeping in mind that carbon offsets are one strategy that we could use, how can we think about the right and appropriate places in which to do it? And transportation, business travel, and study abroad travel make some sense in terms of carbon emissions and carbon offsets. And part of that is because air travel is easily quantifiable. It's a very visible type of travel that we could engage in. So let's talk about that. I've got some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If I can figure out how to do that. All right, I'm going to leave. I think that slide is still up. Amy, could you confirm that on Zoom we're not seeing a slide at the moment?
That's correct.
Okay, great. All right, I am going to move my camera so that we can see Professors Giovine and Sylvester. And I'm going to pose a series of questions. I'm hoping this is going to be a conversation. Paul and Michael and I have had some of these conversations in the past. We have a feel for some of the ideas and assumptions we're working with and where some of those assumptions might conflict a little bit. But let's start out by talking about the logic of offsetting carbon emissions for travel, but doing so in a bigger sense by thinking about sustainability in travel, and particularly sustainability in terms of study abroad. Michael, what would that broader sense of sustainable study abroad mean?
No, I think it's really interesting. When we were planning this talk, Paul was like, there's a lot of Paul in this. Paul talks a lot about carbon offsets and carbon. I don't do as much of that, but I do think about study abroad in terms of like, what is it? How is it measured? How can it be sustainable? And I think that's kind of the key question that we're dancing around here a little bit is, are we talking about sustainability, which you just asked me, or are we talking about being carbon neutral in study abroad? Those are interrelated things, right? Being carbon neutral is like, making sure that your travel and your carbon usage in a trip, right? And a trip abroad, but it can also be here. I mean, we often call it study away in some campuses, or is it more holistic sustainability? So sustainability, we often think of as having three pillars, right? There's economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and socio-cultural sustainability. And all of those have to be present, right? In order for something to be sustainable. But each, depending on what you're doing, what your perspective is on what the deliverable is, what you want to get out of this, let's say, study abroad program, you're going to balance things out, right? I mean, you want to be carbon neutral. Sure, we could be carbon neutral. We could pay tons of offsets, but it might not be economically sustainable, right? You guys might have to pay $1,000 more, $100 more or something in order for it to be environmentally sustainable, but then it might not be economically sustainable. Or like I know, there are even, people here and on Zoom and professors at Westchester who, make very conscious effort to practice what they preach, to not fly or to fly every couple of years or something like that, to make sure that they are, kind of net neutral. I'm a hypocrite, right? I take students every year to Italy and I travel and I have a very high carbon footprint when I do this. But I think that there are other deliverables, right? I think that there's the educational component, the cultural component, teaching sustainability in a location is going to be a high impact learning experience. You'll learn more about sustainability that might have repercussions all the way to the future. But am I going to be carbon neutral? No, So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, right? But it's slightly different. The carbon neutrality is the component of environmental sustainability. It's also not the only thing, right? You were talking a lot about flights, and yeah, sure, the airlines are really readily measurable. It's much less easy to measure, although it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible to measure your total carbon footprint when you're studying abroad, right? And different ways to programmatically include that. Maybe I'll talk about that later. I don't want to talk too long. Could actually do that, right? Like, what kind of food do you eat when you're there? Is it local food that's sourced right from the place that you're at, or are you getting industrial food, right? Which has a large carbon footprint to fly steak from, wherever, from Argentina all the way to Europe, right? That you're having a carbon footprint that you have to measure when you're doing that, or you're eating, pork or something that's there. Often, a lot of the students, if they're vegetarian, right? I'm going to have tofu, right? I'm going to have tofu in Italy because it's better for the environment. Well, you're flying that tofu, you're oftentimes cutting down rainforests to build, to get the tofu and then flying it over, as opposed to eating the pork that everybody eats right in the location, right? I mean, there's a lot of ethical decisions and all those other things that complicate it, right? But carbon neutrality, what has a higher carbon footprint? Probably tofu, right? Whether you're doing a Rome, Florence, Venice grand tour kind of a thing, or whether you're staying in one location is another thing, right? You're not taking these buses or cars or something like that. So there's lots of decisions that you can make, right, to be sustainable. But obviously the airlines are the big one because they generate 100 times more, carbon footprint than or tons of carbon dioxide than a shared bus, right? And an interesting fact I kind of looked up, so I can't really verify it by Google, but it was this fact that the airline industry uses about 1 billion, right, something like that, like 1 billion tons of carbon a year, which is more than like Germany, the country of Germany produces. So United Airlines, American Airlines, all those airlines combined are more than the carbon footprint of many countries in this world per year. So again, it's an easy target, but it's a good target to have.
Well, thank you. Paul, we were talking earlier about the travel miles being frequently linked to carbon offset programs in colleges and universities. Are there other reasons other than the fact that it's just easy to quantify it that we focus on air travel?
So I think that, pardon me, it's also discrete, meaning to offset heat during the year, there's no clear beginning, there's no clear end, and we take it for granted that we need that heat. The other part is that often travel is a choice, and so we feel guilty about it and look for ways to do it. I can just add something to that. I think that we also don't often choose to do it. I give talks on carbon offsets like this one, and often I don't offset my travel. I buy the ticket, I go, oh, that was expensive, I don't want to pay any more, and I don't do it. And so I want to make the case that we need to be thinking of things in the terms of a system. And we can go into that more, but I don't think that it's going to work to think of us all as individuals doing the right thing, because we will.
On that positive note.
Well, and how many miles are we talking about for study abroad? I know you've done some research on this, and If you can share your screen.
Gave me good numbers about years. So you can see it went down after the pandemic. But we're talking about 4.5 million miles in a year by Westchester students and faculty studying abroad. And so when I look at this, I think of this as an easy A, because when I multiply the number of students in that maximum year, or 536, and if study abroad costs for offsetting, if we average it out, something like $20. So you multiply the number of students by the $20, and it comes to $10,700 to offset all those miles. That might seem like a lot of money until you think that that is one fraction of one student's tuition here at the university. So just a bit of one of your tuition bills. Yeah.
Are you still sharing your screen?
Mhm.
You are. All right. I'm having
I
trouble
can
with.
stop here.
Yeah, I'm just having trouble with. Is it sharing? Because this seems to be my Zoom.
Yeah, now you gotta share it. I'll pull it up.
I'm not seeing a shared screen yet from the Zoom end.
Do you want your screen up or do you want my screen?
Oh, I thought you were using yours. Yeah.
So I stopped doing that.
Probably the combined age of over 100. You know.
Thank you, Michael.
Can I get one response to Michael in? So here on my slide, agreeing with Michael with a caveat. What's that?
What did I say?
You said a lot of things. Okay, but here's the thing. I agree that study abroad can be absolutely transformative, can change your view of our world, our way of life in the United States, and it can lead to long-term changes in behavior. Excellent. My caveat is that it might be counterproductive if students are only learning about individual choices. And they come home thinking that if I change my light bulb and I buy local and so on, that I'm a person who's doing sustainability. Okay, when in fact, that individual approach, that's what the oil companies want us to think about, right? They don't want us to think about, they don't want us to think about collective effort. They don't want us to think about systemic change. And so here's an example of systemic change. If it is still financially advantageous for a company to pollute, they're going to pollute because that's their purpose. That's what they're there to do, to maximize profits for their shareholders. Collective systemic change would regulate that. And there are a lot of different ways to do cap and trade or other approaches. But if changing my light bulb is going to keep me from being an activist and working for systemic change, then it can be counterproductive.
Can I interject for a second? Because you jumped the shark a little bit. I didn't really say that yet, but we talk about that all the time because we, I kind of disagree sometimes on this stuff. But I think just to clarify what Paul was saying, and I think it's a good thing, is that why would we want to study abroad in general? Why is it that, look, the university, at least before COVID, right, the big thing that a couple grants that we worked on and everything, is that we are caught in a catch-22. We got Brad over here, Dr. Flamm over here, writing these papers, doing our climate action plan that says that we need to be climate neutral, right, or carbon neutral by 2025 or whatever. And then you have people in GEO, the Office of and higher, right, in internationalization as one of our main focuses of the strategic plan. And before, in 2019, when we all started talking about this, before the COVID, there was a different, a whole different people working in the Office of internationalization, I guess GEO, as we call it now. And they wanted to have, the goal was 100% of students to study abroad, right? And that has changed with a regime change. But how do you get 100% of the students to study abroad and also carbon neutrality? It's a catch-22. It doesn't work, right? But so that's where I always come in, that's where, Paul would say, we need to start paying off this stuff, right? We need to start using carbon offsets to offset all of this stuff. That's the easy way to do it. It is the easier way of doing it, even though it's more financially costly. Whereas I would say, look, there are also other ways of being sustainable, right, within study abroad. What are the things that study abroad does? Why do we need to be international? Why do we need internationalization? Well, study abroad does a couple of things, right? When we talk about this, is about, like you said, people voluntarily, temporarily, going elsewhere. It could also be to Lancaster or whatever, to change the scenery, to engage with the other, right? To engage with otherness. As anthropologists, we always talk about tourism and study abroad, pilgrimage, as being this engagement with something different than ourselves, because it forces us to be reflexive and be like, oh my God, they do it this way. How do I do it, right? And that could also be, how do you live more sustainably, in that kind of way, that you get this education, you get self-reflexivity. Internationalization offices around the country often talk about creating global citizens, right? It's a very nebulous term that means that you are comfortable with diversity and have a global and holistic and systems mindset, including being sustainable, right? Understanding your impacts even at home and how it impacts somebody abroad, right? And then, of course, it's this idea of this high impact learning experience. And you guys, most of you here in the audience are my students and other students, and you don't know how often we have to talk about and justify our syllabi and all the other stuff that we do, and to say, what will be the most highest impact for you guys, right? What can I do, right, as a professor, as an instructor, that will get you to remember my class, right, and the lessons that I'm teaching in my classes. And I'm really big into this. I run a study abroad program. I run a teaching museum. Like, how do you get hands-on, ways that will stick with you, right? And so, those are all those kinds of really the importance of study abroad, right? And that's, I think, what you're saying. You're agreeing with me, but yet we really do need to deal with, are you thinking individually, right? Because at the end of the day, you're signing up as an individual and you're trying to become an individual global citizen, right? It's almost like this another one of these paradoxes. But the other thing I wanted to say really quickly is how many study abroad programs actually even go that far, right? Yeah. I have my sustainable food systems class. It always coincides in the fall with the open house, the study abroad open house, and I asked them, and I'm not trying to promote my own trip, although I am as well, as you guys know, a lot of you know. But I asked them, how many trips do talk about sustainability, number one, and how many trips seem sustainable, because they might not actually say it, right? Mine is one of the only ones, if not the only one, that actually is we're doing sustainability abroad, right? There are a couple other ones that are very sustainable and they incorporate sustainability. I know you have a slide. Rwanda, for example, my colleagues do it in Rwanda. I mean, you don't even use toilets for plumbing, right? I mean, when you're there, and that was a choice that they made, right? For sustainability, for cultural balance as well. This is how people use it here. So we're not going to put it in toilet. All that kind of stuff, right? But very few actually focus on sustainability. And so, regardless of individual children, I mean, you're just going to see museums in Florence or something.
Right, let alone systems.
Right, let alone systems.
Yeah.
Well, we want to leave enough time for some questions and answers from the audience, but I do want to sum up a bit by saying, listening to the two of you talk and thinking about these issues, I'm left with two big questions. The first is, how do we bring sustainability into study abroad and into Westchester University academics in general? How do we do that well? The second question is, how do we use carbon offsets responsibly, whether it's in study abroad programs or in for other purposes at the university? And we're at 7:45. How do we do it in a way that honors our commitment to environmental, social, and economic sustainability? for our community and for the communities that would be impacted by projects that we are supporting through carbon offsets.
I have 1 minute to answer the first question, and I do want to turn over to you because you have a lot of good stuff, to talk about. So in terms of sustainability, one of the ways, in addition to or without doing carbon offsets, is that you can kind of, if you really try, you can programmatically change a study abroad program to be more sustainable, right? And I kind of mentioned these things, and I'm an advocate of that. So yes, you fly X amount to get to Italy or to Tanzania, right? But then you have to think, can we offset that, like literally offset the amount of carbon each individual student has consumed in the flight over by staying in a destination and using less carbon than you would when you are in Westchester, okay? Because as Americans, we use the most, right? So being somewhere else, especially someplace like Tanzania, where often they turn off, the electricity at night, so you can't use electricity, and all your food is local, and you're staying for like 6 weeks, so that there's enough time to accumulate a negative footprint compared to when you're at home. You can calculate how long that trip has to be to basically benefit, to be like, it's better to fly to Tanzania and then use less than to just stay in Westchester, like as a person, right? So you can think about all that. My trip, we stay in one city. We don't go all over the place using buses and things. It's about local food, sustainable food systems and heritage. So we're eating sustainably. We're eating, living there. You have to separate your trash, you learn this stuff. You talk to people, and hopefully not only do you have a lower carbon footprint, and I'm not saying you balance out, but when you come back home, hopefully you take some of those lessons, the high impact learning experience, and then in the future, as hard as it is to measure, you're able to. But what about carbon offsets instead of abroad?
All right, I'm going to try and be brief. Okay, so there are different study abroad programs do sustainably. I'm talking about environmental sustainability. So someone wrote a paper grading the study abroad programs at the University of Richmond. I'm just going to talk about the categories and leave it there. Yep. Okay, so the areas where they graded them were the experience of the students, the education that those students get through that experience, the incentives they have for taking part, the price, the effectiveness, and the impact. And so you can see here that the China program gets very low grades, and the South Africa program gets very high grades. And so as we think about our study abroad programs and making them environmentally sustainable, we should be thinking really explicitly about how we're doing in all those areas. The couple other things about study abroad and carbon offsets here at Westchester is the question of who's going to carry it forward. Question about leadership from the top. Well, we've gotten word that carbon offsets can't be done with student money unless it has an educational intent. That's both an opportunity and an easy out. It's an opportunity for us to design programs, but that's not going to happen soon. As Michael said, we have a lot of programs, and the vast majority of them aren't oriented to sustainability. So who else can lead it? The Office of Sustainability can help talk about it, but y'all can't fund it, right? And so then there's the Sustainability Council, again, can advocate for it, but they can't do it. Center for Instructional Programs, that's where I think the most politically viable way to do it is, which is to charge $20 for anybody studying abroad and offset it that way. I don't see any other routes being possible anytime soon.
And it could be talking about learning outcomes, right? Student learning outcomes. This is the other thing, right? You guys might not know all this stuff you have to deal with, right? Like dealing with student learning outcomes. study of mine, how I would answer that question about like, oh, well, it's not about the student education. Number one, study abroad actually really is very hard to measure the outcomes. How do you measure that you guys have become a global citizen? Right? Like, how, I mean, you have to also jump to the future to see if you're actually, future oriented, that you're actually doing this, right? A lot of education, study abroad, are informal education. It's living in the place, it's staying in the place, it's talking to people, it's seeing something new. And it's very hard to capture in a syllabus's student learning outcomes. We put those in there so that we justify taking you abroad, but I realize that those are the least of the outcomes that I want you to get. I want you to get really those impactful things that essentially you can't get from zooming into a classroom in Tanzania or in Italy or something, right? That's number one. So, oh, wait, you can't measure this stuff. Number two, there are ways that you can integrate. You can have fundraisers. You can make the students like as part of the program, right? Like you have to raise money to offset your, to buy carbon offsets or something like that. Make it a fun learning experience within. Like you said, and I said, I mean, very few of the study abroad programs, their outcome is to learn about sustainability. And that's not a problem, right? There's all kinds of, art history, you want to learn about art, right? Criminology, you want to learn about different systems.
I hate to cut this off. We are past 12:50, and we always pause at this point because some of you have to get to another class. If that's the case, please feel free to leave. But if you can stay for some more questions and answers, I know the three of us can continue with this conversation with you until nightfall. Yes. We will also share links to some of the resources that have been included in this presentation, including a link to a full presentation that Professor Sylvester gave about study abroad and sustainability. Any questions from those of you who can stay here in person?
So when you're calculating these study abroad miles or any kind of travel miles, especially with a group like a study abroad group, does each traveler have its own calculation, whether or not they're on the same flight or not, for example?
Right. So I get numbers. We get the numbers from the Global Engagement Geo, and so they list the miles from here to wherever they're going, and multiply those by the number of students. But as you say, it could be different flights, could be different connections, could be different size of planes, which all factor into that. But we've got some rough numbers.
Whether it sounds like it would be saved by coordinating the same transportation.
Yeah, so going to the airport, for example, like if you did a bus to the airport or a bus pickup, it was individual taxis or your parents driving you, yeah, sure. I mean, it'll be slightly different, all that gets factored in. When I was talking, I should give credit to my colleague in James Madison University, Jennifer Kaufman, who really measured like extreme precision. She had her students measure their carbon footprint in Virginia. And then when they were abroad in the different programs that she ran, Tanzania and Malta, I want to say, something like that. And they had like measures about the electrical, all kinds of stuff. Like beyond my mental capacity. And, so she was able to understand like how, and then calculate how long does my trip have to be in this destination in order to offset the flight. Of course, the flights are different as well. We can't all do that. But that is something that, but yeah, every student's gonna be different too, right? The amount of carbon footprint differs by your age, or where you live, what kind of transportation you use, all that kind of stuff. Your economic mobility.
Paul, could you stop sharing your screen? It looks like Professor Wanko has a question. Cheryl, could you unmute yourself and go ahead.
Absolutely. Hi everyone. Thank you. Thanks for taking this question, and thank you for raising this issue because it's really important. I have actually two questions, and one is just a quick one. Has anyone had this conversation with the Office of International or Global Programs yet? 2 is more complicated. I was one of those people, and Paul, you mentioned this, like the transformative, power of travel when you're young. I didn't do study abroad, but I did go abroad. And I could point to that as where I started to think of sustainability. I don't know if any of you grew up in the 70s, but in the 70s, we didn't have vegetables for dinner. I went over to France. Look at that. You could have a dinner of all vegetables. So, I mean, it was just, that shock. So yeah, so that's where I'd place my start as even thinking about sustainability. However, the flip side, what I also think it did was whet my continued appetite for travel. And so I worry about these conflicting things that we are teaching students, right? Not just, hey, go over here and you see how other people live. And it's important because for me, breaking the United States is the only way people, can possibly live on the planet is important, an important sustainability mission or lesson. But it's also, I think, one of the things we're doing is training our students to be consumers of flight and other types of high impact practices. I just didn't know if you had any comments about that or about the whole, as anyone talked to the office business. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I was, it's a great point. I was thinking of you when I was talking before, because I said, why don't you just come with me to Italy, right? And you're like, well, I measure out, right? You are very good about like practicing what you preach and like not traveling all the time. You have to for your job, but only every once in a while. But I would say, I'll speak as an anthropologist, but also as any other, professor or anything, we all entertain multiple identities, multiple ethics at the same time, multiple moralities at the same time. And, study abroad, number one, and this is what I talk about in my book, right? Here's my plug for my book, Study Abroad in the Quest for an Anti-Tourism Experience, is that study abroad itself is an ethical decision, right? It positions itself as ethical, better and more impactful than just mass tourism, all that kind of stuff, right? But sustainability is also an ethical issue, right? And what ethics is it weighs different moralities, moral and often conflicting in the moment moral decisions. What trumps what? And everybody therefore has different ethics. You were talking about the individual light bulb thing. Aristotelian ethics would say that this is for virtue ethics, that starting small, right, and inculcating small changes, even if they don't mean much, like recycling, which actually doesn't do much in general, right, can have the potential to make you a more virtuous person, and it snowballs and you do bigger and bigger and bigger things. That is different than utilitarianism, right, or where you're what's maximal bang for your buck kind of thing. Those are different ethical decisions. So we occupy these different moralities all at the same time, and every person is different, and they make a different decision.
Respectfully, I think Aristotle was wrong.
Yeah, sure. Right. You're not a virtuous.
Right. I think that not completely, but I think often it cuts the other way. We do a little thing, we feel pretty good about ourselves, and then we don't do the
Absolutely. What about the other question Cheryl had about how have you been traveling savers?
I've talked with the new director. She said that she would talk to people in the senior administration about, and if I'm understanding right, I think that she feels, well, yeah. So I don't want to. So it remains unclear to me whether or not Geo needs approval from senior administration, or if Geo can just do this. The director is interested and sympathetic to this cause.
Yeah, I think the Geo office went through a name change and staff change and everything else, and I think that there's a lot of things that it's doing. The bigger issue is that goes beyond this is the fact that post-COVID, all study abroad programs are changing, right? And it's mostly about changing to mitigate risk more, right? And that's something that we were a little bit behind, and in the last 2 years they've been improving on, right? Like how do you keep intentionally keep the students safer, mitigate risk, all those kinds of things, right? And I think they need to deal with that before they can then turn to something that we already know is not fully supported, right, on the upperest levels, the highest levels. Right?
But, okay, we committed to offsetting all travel, business travel and study abroad by 2020. We keep hearing, it's not the right time. It's not the right time. It is the right time. 2020 was the right time.
Oh, yeah. Nobody tried.
And yeah, and so I don't think that we should wait for this to come down at us. It's our responsibility to convince the people who can do these things that it's time. And until we do that, it's not going to happen.
We're a little bit past 1. Is there one more question before we? Let's see, have there been some in the chat, or is there one here from the audience? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, this is just a general question. I did want to talk to and study abroad, and I saw some correlation just between local environmental and economic efforts. And I was wondering where in study abroad in general, there might be some correlation between things that are economically effective and then also environmentally.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Sure. So things that were maybe both economically, I think a lot of time we think of environmental sustainability as being less cost effective, and sometimes it is. But I was wondering in the study abroad realm, if anyone.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, let's think. There are a lot of different ways like carbon footprints are, that they increase your carbon footprint study abroad. How about the choice of your lodging? Are you staying in really like resort areas, 5-star, 4-star, whatever, where they spend, a lot on cleaning, a lot of this stuff. They pump in all of the food from industrial sources to accommodate you the semester at sea, cruise ship kind of stuff. Or would it be something more about like homestays or living locally and on a farm, camping, something like that? I mean, those are the core. It's actually more cheaper, right? It's more economically sustainable, but also more environmentally sustainable. But is it as comfortable? Am I going to get as many people? If I'm like, hey, let's camp on the side of a mountain for 5 weeks. I don't think a lot of people are going to want to do that. So it's balanced.
So Shelburne Road slowly went away.
Yeah, these things are.
That was an answer to a chat within some of the Zoom.
Your question's great. It's gets to the crux of these issues. So last night I was looking for pictures related to sustainability in Westchester, and I made this discovery that in 2014 Westchester was named Tree Campus USA, like Miss America of the tree planting.
And then we cut down all the trees on the quad, which we did to put in the geothermal stuff.
Okay, so and this included the service learning project. This was part of the contest, right? It also included investment of money. And so the people who, the John Bartram Society said, you need to be spending at least $3 per student to get this award. So, but they said most campuses pay 9 or 10. Okay, so let's say it was $3 per student. That comes to $51,000. And then the question is, okay, there was the service learning project. My guess is that didn't include thousands of people. And we spent a lot of money. So you can plant a lot more trees for $51,000 in the global south, in countries in the global south, than you can here at Westchester. And so implicit in all this is decision makings of where you get your best bang for your buck, right? Which is at the heart of your question. And planting trees, people who evaluate carbon offsets say it's one of the worst ways to use your money, because it's going to take 40 years for that to be a big, gorgeous tree. And if somebody wants to have pasture, all those trees can go away.
Also, you have to, I mean, there have been people talking about, even around here, carbon offset planting trees like in Marsh Creek and stuff, that then they plant it and then they don't take care of it and then it'll die. Right? Like, I mean, you know, this isn't like just one
Yeah.
big fix.
Right, so $3 to
Plant the tree.
yeah, right, and then who knows how much else, yeah.
I hate to do this, but we're at 1:06 and we're going to need to end the Zoom connection, but please join me in thanking Professor Michael Giovine and Professor Paul Sylvester for being part of this conversation.
Thank you.
All right, and please join us next week for the last in our series for this semester. Goodbye.
Thank you.